At this point, we have a fairly complete view of Aristotle's conception of happiness. Happiness is virtuous rational activity. We get that in book 1. In books 2 through 5, he goes through one kind of virtue, namely the moral virtues and their corresponding activities, the emotions, feelings, passions. And then in book 6, he goes through the other kind of virtue, the intellectual virtues. And there are 2 of those, practical wisdom and wisdom. And then you can dive into metaphysics, the beginning of the metaphysics, to get a bit clearer account of wisdom. But now we've got an account of all of the virtues. And so a kind of more complete picture of happiness, of what our target should be as we live our lives. In book 10, Aristotle's going to complicate the picture a little bit. Because one question you might have is, well, are all of these things equally important? Are all of these virtues equally important? And at first glance, it seems like, well, no, of course they couldn't be. We didn't talk about it at the time, but one of the moral virtues, for example, that Aristotle mentions is a ready wit. Having a good sense of humor, right? It's a character virtue, according to Aristotle. Clearly, that's not as important as justice or something, right? Some of the virtues seem to be more important than others. And so, yeah, we kind of have this picture of what we should be aiming at, but should certain virtues be given priority? Are certain virtues more important than others? That's what Aristotle addresses in book 10, because Aristotle thinks that yes, certain virtues are more important than other virtues. Now, the way Aristotle frames his discussion in book 10 is in terms of trying to determine what the best kind of life, strictly speaking, is. And he's going to do this by looking at what the best virtue is. And the key to understanding this, I think, or one of the keys to unlocking what he's up to here, you actually find, so he says something about this in book 10, chapter 7, but you actually find it way back in book 1, chapter 7, in the function argument. When we were looking at the function argument, the conclusion of the function argument, as far as we were concerned, was happiness is rational activity in accordance with virtue. That's not, strictly speaking, what the conclusion of the function argument is. If you go back and reread it, what Aristotle says is something like happiness is rational activity in accordance with virtue. And if there's more than one virtue, well, then the most complete and best virtue. And here in book 10, chapter 7, he says something similar. He talks about how happiness is going to be activity in accordance with the highest virtue. Right? What we now know, having read through the rest of the Nicomachean Ethics, or a good chunk of the rest of it, right? There is indeed more than one virtue, right? There's a whole bunch of them. There's all those moral virtues, or those 2 intellectual virtues. And so now the question becomes, well, which of these virtues is the most complete, is the best, is the highest, right? Wisdom, justice, practical wisdom, ready wit, courage. Aristotle gives 2 arguments. There's an argument he gives in book 10, and there's an argument he gets in book 6. These are arguments for what the best virtue, in fact, is. Now, I think most students, when they come to this list of virtues from Aristotle, they're going to want to say that, I don't know, what's the best virtue? Maybe justice. That seems like an important one, right? Maybe justice is the best virtue, and maybe that's what we're going to see Aristotle argue. That's not what Aristotle argues. He does not think justice is the best virtue. He thinks it's the best moral virtue. I think he says something like that in book 5, which we didn't read, but it's not the best virtue. According to Aristotle, wisdom is. And so we get 2 arguments, one in book 10 and one in book 6. Let's look at them very quickly for the conclusion that wisdom is the best virtue. What he says in book 10 is that the best virtue is going to be the virtue of the best part of us. So we have various parts. We've seen that division of the soul. There are those various parts of us. There's the vegetative part, there's the appetitive part, the scientific part, and the deliberative part. And so what Aristotle is saying is the best virtue is going to be the virtue of the best part of us, of the best thing in us. Well, what's the best thing in us? What Aristotle claims in Book 10 is the best part of us is our intellect, our mind, our reason. And what he really has in mind here is the scientific part of us, the theoretical part of our soul. That's the best part of us. And as we know, wisdom is the virtue of that part. And so the best virtue is wisdom. That's the Book 10 argument. Now, one of the key steps there, I'm just going to focus on one of the steps. The key step there is this idea, this claim that the best part of us is our intellect. The best part of us is that theoretical, scientific part of the soul. You might think, well, what reason is there to think that? I mean, yeah, doing math is fine and all, but is that the best thing we do? Is that the best part of us? Why think that? Aristotle doesn't explain, not here at least. But his idea, I take it, is something like this. The best part of us is going to be that which we share in common with the gods, with the divine. It's going to be the divine part of us. And if we look at the gods, if we look at the divine, they live a certain kind of life, Aristotle thinks. Do they grow? Do they have cells? Do they vegetate? No, they don't have bodies. So they don't have a vegetative part of the soul. And so that's not going to, our vegetative part is not going to be the best part of us. Because look, the gods are better than us. Whatever part of soul they have, well, and if we have that same part, that's the best part of us. Not vegetative. Well, maybe it's the appetitive part. Aristotle thinks that in order to have appetites, you also need to have a body. And so inasmuch as the god doesn't have a body, it also doesn't have appetites. And so the appetitive part of our soul is not the best part of us. But then the gods, this philosophical principle, this thing, the unmoved mover, as Aristotle calls it, it also doesn't deliberate. It doesn't engage in actions. It doesn't, should we go to war? It doesn't do anything like that. It doesn't think about how to act, right? That's not how the gods operate. It doesn't have a deliberative part of the soul. What does a god do? According to Aristotle, the gods are kind of engaged in thought. They know everything. They are omniscient in a particular sense. And so that's the only part of the soul that the gods have. They have knowledge of the most fundamental truths about things. They have knowledge of truth, right? They have a scientific soul, a theoretical soul. And so our scientific part of our soul, the part of our soul with which we can come to understand why things happen the way they do, the part of our soul that we can use to understand why, right? That's what the gods have. That part of us is like a divine fragment that we have, that is us, right? So there's this kind of divine element almost within human beings, and it's this scientific, theoretical part of their soul. It's the part of the soul that they use to understand, right? Gods understand. They have knowledge. And so in as much as we engage in that kind of activity, we're doing what the gods do. Okay, so that's the first argument he gives. In Book 6, he also gives an argument for why wisdom is the best virtue. And in Book 6, what he's concerned with is comparing wisdom with practical wisdom. Is practical wisdom the best virtue? Well, what Aristotle says is that the best virtue is going to be the virtue that's concerned with the best thing. And look, practical wisdom, it's concerned with human beings. It's concerned with human things, human activities. And human beings are not the best thing. They're pretty good, according to Aristotle. They're better than dogs. They're better than clams and seaweed. But they're not the best thing. They are not better than the gods, according to Aristotle. The best thing is God, and wisdom is concerned with God, and so wisdom is the best virtue. right? So they're similar arguments, but they work in slightly different ways, as you can see, right? But they both come to the conclusion that this wisdom, this knowledge of fundamental explanations, this knowledge of God is the best virtue, right? And in Aristotle's view, God lives a life of wisdom. God thinks about God. The details of that get tricky. We're not going to get into it. But so insofar as we can live this life of wisdom, insofar as we can engage in wisdom, we are living a divine life, a life fit for the gods. Yeah. Now, you might think, well, that's all fine and good. Aristotle only thinks, I don't know, what good reason is there for this? Aristotle just thinks this because he's like into philosophy and God and stuff like that and theology. And like, I don't know, fine for him. But I don't know. Really, wisdom is the best virtue? Well, why not justice? Justice seems a lot more important. Aristotle addresses this in Book 10. And he says something like this. Look, justice is important. Justice is a very important virtue, but it's not the best thing. And here's a reason why. It would be better if we never had to be just, if there were no occasion for justice. The world would be better. We could be better. We could live better lives, essentially. That's what he'd say. But the world would be better. It'd be better if there were never any need for justice. That's a sign that justice is not the most choice-worthy thing. Well, what do you mean it'd be better if there were no need for justice? What does that mean? Why do we need justice? It's because people do terrible things. It's because people are treated unjustly. It's because there are, certain groups of people are subjected to kind of systematic mistreatment, which needs to be rectified, which needs to be ameliorated, right? And so we need to fight for justice. Justice is often reactive. It's usually reactive, Aristotle would want to say. We engage in just actions because something has gone wrong, because something has gone askew. People are being treated poorly and unfairly. And so we use justice to remedy these bad situations. It would be better if those bad situations never arose. That's Aristotle's point. Justice, yeah, it's choice-worthy for its own right because it's a virtue and it's in the virtuous actions and so on. It's choice-worthy for its own right, fine. But it's also choice-worthy for what it achieves. It's choice-worthy as a means, right? We do the just thing so that these people can live a better life, so that our society will be more stable, and so on, right? And so justice, it's not going to be the best virtue. It's not going to be the most important thing we engage in because it's not the most choice-worthy thing. It's choice-worthy, or it's not the most final virtue. It's not the most complete virtue. Sure, we choose it for its own right, but we also choose it for the sake of what it affects. We choose it as a means. And ideally, there'd be no need for justice. We wouldn't even need to have justice. The world would be better if we didn't have to be just, right? If there were no need for us to be just. And so justice can't be really what life is all about at the end of the day, is what Aristotle is saying. Wisdom, understanding, that's a much better candidate, according to Aristotle. Right? So wisdom is the best or highest virtue. And so happiness, strictly speaking, is the activity of wisdom. The activity of wisdom, Aristotle uses the word contemplation as a technical term to refer to the activity of wisdom. And so Aristotle concludes in these chapters from Book 10 that the contemplative life is the best life. The life of wisdom. More generally, you might think of this as the life of the mind, the life devoted to truth, to the most important truths. That's really what we are called to as human beings. That's the most important kind of life. The life of the mind, developing your intellect. And one of the reasons, the main reason Aristotle would think we need to strive for justice for disadvantaged people, say in particular, is so that they might be able to develop themselves. They might be able to develop their minds, because by being mistreated, they're put at a disadvantage for developing themselves. That's what their mistreatment affects. And so one of the reasons we want to engage in just activity is so that people will be better able to develop their intellects, develop their minds, and live a life that is choice-worthy in its own right, right? Live a contemplative life, a life of the mind. Yeah, that's Aristotle's idea. And this idea here, that the contemplative life is the best life, that the life of the mind is what's truly important for a human life, that truth is of the utmost value. This idea, it's hard to overstate the important influence that this idea has had on human culture. It's because people took this idea seriously that, for example, we have universities. Universities were founded as institutions devoted to this ideal. They were founded by people who thought Aristotle, and people like Aristotle, so this would include Plato and other such philosophers, who thought that Aristotle and these other philosopher types were right, that truth really is the most important thing that human beings can achieve in their lives, that this life of the mind, developing your intellect, really is what's central to living a flourishing, full human life, right? And it's why we got the explosion of scientific knowledge that we got, right? That was affected in part by universities, developed through universities, developed by people, by institutions devoted to this ideal. Now, one last point I want to make here. Happiness, strictly speaking, is the activity of wisdom. I put strictly speaking there. What does that mean? Aristotle seems he wants to say there are kind of degrees of happiness, right? The best kind of happiness, strictly speaking, is this life of the mind. And so we ought to engage in it as much as we possibly can. You know, at one point he even says we ought to try to become like the gods, or become divine, partake in this divine activity as much as we can. But he realizes, I think, that this isn't, not everybody's suited for that kind of thing. Let's say you don't have the temperament to be a philosopher, to engage in this life of the mind like this. Does that mean your life is a waste? No. A life devoted to the other virtues, which in this chapter he calls, in this book, he calls the political life. Don't worry about why he calls it that, right? The life devoted to practical wisdom, to justice, to the other moral virtues. That's still a worthwhile life. That's still a good life. That's a flourishing life. That's a kind of happiness. It's not the best kind of happiness. That is the contemplative life. But the political life, the life of the other virtues, is still a very worthwhile, laudable, flourishing life. And so I don't think he's going to say that it's, you know, contemplation or bust. That's not the idea. And he's not going to say that we ought to, right? And so he's going to allow for other kinds of happiness. And also, he's not going to say that we ought to contemplate to the exclusion of the other virtues. That's not his idea. He would say that, no, you ought to contemplate as much as you can, but circumstances might be such that you really don't have opportunity to, because you've got to fight all this injustice that's going on, or because you have all these people that you need to go be generous to, and to be generous to them, you got to go earn the money, and so and so you don't have time to contemplate. Aristotle wants to say the ideal life, even this ideal contemplative life, it's also going to be a life of the moral virtues for those situations where the moral virtues are required. Right, and so it depends on kind of your situation and your context. Now, the last thing that I want to show you guys is this. Well, we're going to return to this kind of chain that we saw when we were looking at the function argument, when we were looking at the human good. But I also want to show you this kind of neat passage that people have actually recently just discovered. So first, this chain. You'll remember something like this from when we first started in Aristotle. Why are you watching the video? Well, to learn philosophy, to pass class, blah, 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 right? To achieve the highest good, to be happy. Something like that is what Aristotle's wanting to say. And what we see now in the meantime is that he wouldn't necessarily be critical of this. Aristotle thinks you do need money, and, and you should go find yourself some money. You need money so that maybe you can have some leisure time to contemplate. That's one reason why it's good to have some money, so you can have some time where you can go contemplate. Yeah, that's good. You need, or you might even think about it this way. Well, whatever. Well, but you also need money for to be generous, to help fight injustice. Say, yeah, you need money. And so, yeah, go watch the video, learn the class, get the degree, blah, 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 get a job. And so you can do generous activities, right? Engage in virtuous, generous, rational activity, generous using of your money. Yeah, that's what happiness in part consists in. So that's a worthwhile thing to do. But now, let's say, I've been talking now a bit about wisdom and this life of the mind. And let's say you are just absolutely hooked. You think that that's right. Absolutely. I want to be a philosopher. I want to study the first causes of being qua being. I can't imagine myself doing anything else with my life. And so you go to, I don't know where you go or what form you fill out. You decide to become a philosophy major, right? Let's say that's what you do. I'm going to be a philosophy major. I'm convinced. Well, at some point or other, you're probably going to have to talk to other people about that. You're probably going to have to talk to, say, your parents, your grandparents, your uncles, aunts, cousins, somebody, roommate, anybody. And what do you think they would say? So you call up your parents, say, just to focus on them. And you say, hey, guy, yeah, I'm going to become a philosophy major. I think most people for most people, the first question that their parents would ask, well, why are you doing that? We're going to spend $250,000 on your education so you can be a philosophy major. How would you answer your parents, right? How would you address what they're saying? Aristotle's got the answer. And it comes in a text that was recently discovered. So there are works of Aristotle that have been lost. And one of these works, it was a very famous work in its day, back in Aristotle's day, it's called the Protrepticus. And it was kind of Aristotle's defense of philosophy. And some scholars, one of them was at the University of Toronto, the other one's at UC San Diego, have been piecing together this work because it's quoted by other authors, and they've been taking these quotations and kind of piecing together how this Protrepticus that Aristotle wrote went. And it contains a really nice quote for how to answer your parents. And so I want to show it to you. It's kind of, I don't know, I think it's exciting, but I guess I'm just a nerd. Right? Because what your parents are probably going to say is like, look, philosophy, that's useless. What are you going to do with philosophy? Right? That's totally useless. Here's, I tell this joke every semester. How do you get the philosophy major off your front porch? You pay him for the pizza, right? Philosophy doesn't do anything, right? Fine, go get your major and then go. You're not going to do anything with that. It's useless, yeah? Here's Aristotle's answer to that complaint. Here's what you throw in your parents' face when they say something like that to you. To seek from every kind of knowledge something other than itself, and to require that it must be useful, is the demand of someone utterly ignorant of how far apart in principle good things are from the necessities. They are totally different. For among the things without which living is impossible, the ones which are appreciated on account of something else should be called necessities. So, for example, look over to the right, you're getting a degree. That's a necessity in Aristotle's sense because you appreciate it, you choose it on account of something else. Getting the job. Getting a job would also be a necessity in Aristotle's sense because you're doing that in order to get the money, right? While all those that are appreciated for themselves, even if nothing else results from them, should be called goods in the strict sense. What he's saying there is that really the good things are what's up at the top of that chain. The highest good is really the only good thing. For this is not valuable because of that, and that for the sake of something else, and this goes on proceeding to infinity. Rather, this comes to a stop somewhere. What he's saying there is that those chains can't go on forever. They have to stop from somewhere. And what he just told us before that is wherever that chain stops, that's strictly speaking what's good. So it is absolutely ridiculous, Mom and Dad, then to seek from everything a benefit beyond from the thing itself. And to ask, so what's the benefit for us? And what's the use of that? For it's true what we say. Such a fellow doesn't seem like someone who knows noble goodness. Zing, right? The fact that philosophy is useless, right? That there's nothing up above it. There's nothing you'd use it for. There's nothing you'd choose it for the sake of. Far from being a point against philosophy is a point in its favor, because the highest good, whatever it is going to be useless. There's no arrow coming out of the highest good. And so the fact that philosophy, or wisdom as Aristotle calls it, is useless is actually a sign that it's the highest good, right? We can't just always be looking for another advantage for what something is useful for, because then the question always arises, well, the thing that it's useful for, why is that good? Why is that good? Why is that good? You have to end somewhere. And Aristotle's idea here is that knowledge and understanding is where we should end. That's the end. And so if something gives you knowledge or understanding, it's valuable in its own right, and it's worth pursuing just for its own sake. And so to ask what the use of it is to be misguided, is to be utterly ignorant, is to be someone who doesn't know noble goodness, as he puts it at the very end. And so the picture he's giving us here is a little bit different. So yeah, fine, learn philosophy to get money, to get your job, to get a degree, and so, or whatever, learn philosophy to get the degree, to get the job, to get money. That's fine, so you can go be generous. But there's another reason to pursue philosophy. There's another reason to learn philosophy, because learning philosophy gives you the knowledge required for living the best kind of life, right? Developing your mind. And this would be true, I'm not just saying this about philosophy. Aristotle's obviously concerned about philosophy, but the point, I think, generalizes the life of the mind. So not just philosophy, but the sciences and the humanities and everything else, the things you study at a university, right? The classical sciences, the humanities. Developing your mind is worthwhile in its own right. And indeed, it strictly speaking, is what human flourishing, human happiness consists in. And so, yeah, fine, get your degree and get your job and get money. That's important, and do that. But another way to approach your education at a university is that you are learning the truth about things, and simply knowing the truth about things, the most important truths about things, that's valuable in its own right. Developing your mind is valuable in its own right. And indeed, it's kind of the most important thing in human life.